Hello friends, today we will be talking about governance of biodiversity in India. Governance is actually who decides and how the things are decided while talking about the governance of biodiversity. It can be defined as the interactions among structures, processes and traditions that determine how power is exercised, how decisions are taken on issues of public concern and how citizens or other stakeholders have their say. Traditionally, when we talk about biodiversity governance, we always follow the top-down approach. We have ever believed that the local communities who have been living in the forest, who have been consuming and taking care of the biodiversity, have most of the time been ignored. We don't take their views or their expertise or their knowledge and innovations while framing the policies of biodiversity governance. And therefore, it is pertinent today that we think about that how local citizens and issues of public concern can be taken up by biodiversity governance. It is also been realized that all the governance policies and other rules, regulations, whatever they are formed, they are all futile without the involvement of the local communities. And therefore, instead of following the bottom up approach, we have always been talking about top down approach, and the exclusionary principle is being followed at many places. The issues of world biodiversity or the global conservation issues are being talked upon, but we hardly take care about the local issues which are there, which are being taken up by the local communities there, and there the biodiversity is native and is more rich than at places which have not been known so far. So, governance, in a way we can say that governance encompasses policies, institutions, processes and power. So, all these four decide that what kind of governance and what kind of the ruling or the decisions will be made with respect to the biodiversity conservation and other related areas. For example, first of all we talk about policies. Now, policies are hardly believed that they are formed by the government, but they also involve the set of rules and regulations, and they just tell us or give an idea that how a particular rule which has been formed, how it gets implemented on the ground level. What are the deciding factors? Those things are given under policies, and even the private sectors and other the NGOs etc. they have their own policies with respect to the local area, with respect to the local biology of that particular region. The policies are formed, and these policies determine that how the biodiversity conservation programs and the things will shape up with respect to the conservation issues. Similarly, institutions. Now, institutions are often thought of as organizations, but there is a clear distinction between these two. Now, institutions are the rules, regulations and set pattern of conduct which determine that how the rules etc. will function in the ground level, whereas organizations are just group of the people who function, who implement those things which have been given by the policies and the frameworks of rules and regulations and the conduct which has been given. Similarly, the process, whenever any rule or any regulation is formed, it is not arbitrarily done, but it follows a certain process. Now, this process involves certain stages. It involves lot of debates, deliberations. There is an involvement of lot many people in it, and after going through several stages, there comes a rule or a law that will determine that what kind of approach are we going to adopt for conserving a particular plant or an animal species. And last and not the least important is power. Now, power is the most important deciding factor. So as to agree to a particular subject, agree to a particular amendment or agree to a particular idea that has come up for the conservation of tigers or any other endemic species or any other category of the plant or the animal. So, looking back, if we talk about biodiversity governance, there is a need for a coordination between all these four factors that can only give a proper governance resumes which can have a better conservation approach. Broadly speaking, when we talk about framework, there is CBD's ecosystem approach, which means that land, water, flora, fauna, all these function in an integrated manner. And when they function in an integrated manner, there is a clear signal that we cannot pay attention to any particular species neglecting the other aspects of the ecosystem. So this approach clearly defines that there has to be a synchrony, there has to be a coordinated mechanism while framing the governance policies, that all the segments and the components of the environment at that particular place are playing a vital role and they are interlinked with each other. Then there are 12 principles of ecosystem approach. The list of these principles is long and more or less they convey the message that ecosystems do not function in isolation. There are plants, animals, the communities, the forest dwellers, the tribals, etc. are there, and the actions of these communities have to have on the local biological diversity of that area. And therefore, whatever the effects we have, they must have to be considered, they must have to be taken care while we are forming any governance policies. So these 12 principles decide that there has to be local, regional and the national global efforts. When we talk about biodiversity governance, there has to be a coordinated mechanism and there should be a way to know the effect what any policy is going to have on the other, what is the role played by the components of the nature with respect to the biodiversity of that region. Now there are three main objectives of CBD: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. The main objective basically is conservation of biological diversity and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Because of more importance given to first two factors, it is always found that the sustainable use of the components is hardly paid attention. And that is the more need of the hour, because we are extracting things from the biodiversity, we are getting the benefits, those benefits are equally shared, but hardly we pay attention towards the sustainability of those resources, whether those resources will be available forever. Are we making the policies in such a way that those benefits will be there forever, and that is actually the meaning of sustainable use of the components. Whatever be the kind of the component of biodiversity we are using, we have to be thoughtful exactly while framing the governance that there has to be a continuity in their availability particularly. In India, if we follow, there are two models of biodiversity governance. One is state driven conservation and the other one is community based conservation. The clear line of difference between these two is state driven is actually governed by the rules, laws, regulations, there are acts, and community based is taken up by the communities themselves so as to look after the local flora and fauna, so as to look after their needs which are being provided by the biodiversity in their own regions. We talk about state driven conservation. Basically, two things are included. One is protected areas and another one is territorial forests. Protected areas are clearly demarcated areas which have been done so by the government regulations. The entry in these areas or the availability of the resources or doing any sort of activity has to be within the control of the government. And territorial forests are the forests which are found in the pristine areas which provide lot many resources which maintain the ecological cycle, which govern the climate of this particular region. So basically, first of all, we talk about protected areas. It's well known, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, conservation reserves, community reserves, these are the four main protected areas under state driven conservation. National parks are fully functional with the government authorities and they provide maximum protection to the biodiversity in a sense that no human activity is permitted in national parks. Whether it is hunting, whether it is lodging, whatever kind of activity that cannot be done in a national park. And that is the disadvantage which comes with this, is that there is a displacement of lakhs of people when any area is declared as a national park. There is a forced displacement of the people who are living in those areas. Now these people have been living in this area since long, they have been utilizing the resources, and forcefully if if you make them come out of that area, naturally they involve themselves in other illegal activities, and in direct or the indirect way they do harm the region and the biodiversity of that region. Then wildlife sanctuaries are species specific. There is also a governing body, but in this, up to a limited extent, the lodging, the hunting and other kind of activities are permitted within a regulated scale. The areas which are adjacent between one national park and the another, and there are patches which join one national park to sanctuary, and there are regions which are also rich in biodiversity, those areas are designated as conservation reserves. These are small in area and therefore they have little amount of biodiversity in them, but then here also there is no government regulation with respect to the usage of resources in this area. Apart from this, they differ from community reserves in that sense that community reserves are maintained by the local people. Many NGOs have come up to take up these community reserves. These are small patches of lands, maybe forests, and they are devoted for the conservation of particular plant or the animal species. So, protected areas also have limitations with them, in the sense that in India we find that most of the protected areas have just become paper parks. They are not able to function properly because of the interference of so many issues. Most of them are located in a places which are devoid of any interference, in the sense ice caps and icebergs are those places where there is not many things to be done. And apart from this, there is a great interference of the local people, and therefore it restricts the true objective, the motive of construction of the protected parks, or the designation of the protected parks actually does not work properly on grounds if we see, because there are interrelated issues, there are multiple departments working, and in those circumstances it really becomes difficult to monitor that how far the objectives of each protected area is functioning. Apart from this, there are also project tigers, project elephant, such type of areas which are demarcated particularly for the conservation of the species, which we are losing because of increased urbanization and because of climate change, whatever. So, these protected areas have not come up recently, they have colonial origin. These are the 4: Kaziranga National Park, Assam. And the rhino population is here more, and it was made the national park in 1968. Corbett National Park in Uttarakhand is the first national park of India, and it was named after hunter conservationist Jim Corbett in 1936. It was designated as national park. It has highest density of tiger population. Kanha National Park is in Madhya Pradesh. Similarly, Periyar Tiger Reserve in Kerala. So, these reserves date back in the 90s, and therefore, they have changed a lot, the policies have been changed, but so far it has believed that because of the undue interference of so many factors, still we are not able to revive them, and we are not able to bring them up to level that we can say that we have maintained and conserved the biodiversity in these particular areas. These are the institutions which are particularly there for the conservation and the protected area governance, if we see. Number one is National Board for Wildlife. It was initially known as Indian Board for Wildlife, and it comprises of the members from local people, the NGOs, the foresters, the ecologists, the scientists, etc. And the main function is to advise related to biodiversity issues. They advise the government with regards to newer issues coming up in biodiversity, particularly wildlife. They frame policies and they guide accordingly. Similarly, there is central government, there is Ministry of Environment and Forest. The wildlife wing in this ministry advises the government. It is responsible for framing the policies, making an amendments, bringing out some sound regulations, and deciding the future course of action for the protection and maintenance of biodiversity in the most serene areas where no one has been able to make an effort to conserve the biodiversity. Then this National Tiger Conservation Authority (NTC) is particularly devoted for tiger conservation, and it particularly makes an effort to conserve the whole ecological serene where the habitat of tiger is there, because as it has been mentioned earlier, whatever the effort it is done in a one direction will go futile unless and until the interrelatedness occurring in the ecosystem is well taken care of. So, this body also looks into the conservation of the entire ecosystem of that area where the tiger habitats are there, so that there is a growing need and growing concerns coming out with it, so that future things may be taken well care of. Similarly, there is only one body which looks after and which governs the crime occurring within the wildlife series. For example, this is Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, then Central Zoo Authority that looks after the animals in zoos for the health of these animals, because this is a good medium for ex situ conservation of the biodiversity which is done. So, all these are institutional frameworks which have lot many things in them, which have lot many rules, regulations, sections are there, and but the only things which comes that the implementation part, because the rules have been framed very precisely, but when it comes for the implementation, most of the times we are lagging behind and the actual things which should have been done are not taken care of. So, what are the issues if we come up, what are the issues? There are institutional barriers, there are knowledge and capacity barriers, and land related challenges are there. Institutional barriers are some of these: absence of comprehensive landscape conservation policies. As it has been said, there are multiple departments with multiple mandates, with multiple objectives, and at this juncture it becomes very difficult to arrive at a particular objective being satisfied, because in that case some other things will be losing. There is lack of scientific planning, we are not planning scientifically, we are still following the old methods of conservation which may not have meaning in true sense in today's times. Then less importance to marine protected areas. Most of the things which have been stated in the institutional frameworks what we studied just now, most of it is devoted mainly to the terrestrial protected areas. So, the marine diversity and the aquatic flora and fauna whatever we are having, less importance is given to them. Inadequate financial resources, there is always a difference in the need and the availability of the resources. So, that is why many times many organizations who have come up and all the bodies which are there working in the field of biodiversity conservation, they think this as a constraint in their way towards making effective governance policies. And inadequate involvement of local communities. Most of the times when the local communities are displaced or when certain rights of them are hindered, they pay less attention, they are not much involved, and many a times they are not involved by the authorities, they are not consulted, they are not taken care of. So, in that sense those who are living in the vicinity of the forest, if they are not taken into confidence, if their utility and their expertise is not counted, it comes as a barrier towards effective governance policy in the field of biodiversity. Similarly, there are knowledge and capacity barriers. This high dependence of local communities, most of the local communities they are poor, they derive all the things whichever they need for their daily day-to-day living they are getting from the forest, and there is a degradation of the forest, there is a loss of forest today what we are witnessing because of the factors like degradation and climate change and other things. So, in that case they follow some unecological methods to get that resource, which ultimately hinders the biodiversity, which kills the biodiversity, and therefore, because of this excessive dependence of local communities, that biological resources which are there, they are at risk because they will be exploited by the communities as they have no other option. So, there is always an unsustainable practices being followed, whether it is cutting of trees for firewood or whether it is killing of animals or another things are there. Similarly, political unrest, most of the areas we find when there is a political interest, the states are not able to effectively implement all those the rules and regulations what have been formed. So, in that case also it becomes difficult to monitor, and increased man and animal conflict because of the limited space available to the animal to breed, to live and to survive, it starts coming into the human territory, and because of that the killing of the animals, naturally they have to be done for the safety and for self protection. They are being killed by the human beings, and therefore that also acts as a constraint, because in that case the biodiversity conservation objective is being hindered. So, because of these factors also, the governance is not effectively implemented in the field of biodiversity. Then there are certain land related issues also, small and fragmented protected areas and habitat degradation. The land is fragmented, there are small batches of land. So, in that case it is very difficult to implement the rules and regulations and to see that what kind of practices are followed. When in a wildlife sanctuary or a national park, whatever we are designating, outside that particular boundaries there is a limited protection of the wildlife because of the governance issues, because of the departments as we have said, and because of the vested interest, so many things are there. So, there is a limited protection of wildlife outside the protected areas, and similarly there is unscientific and non-compatible land use practices. Activities like farming in small patches, application of chemicals on fields, similarly mining is also done at certain places. All these land use practices naturally they interfere and they disturb the whole living pattern of the animals. So, in that case also the one activity, whether it is an industrialization or mining, that is being looked after by some other body, biodiversity conservation is looked after by some other body, then there are impact assessment is also taking place. So, therefore, it becomes difficult. These type of challenges are there in the forming proper governance in the field of biodiversity. And then there is invasive alien species. These are those species which are these are not native, they grow profusely, and when they grow profusely they also disturb the biological wealth of that region. So, because of their invasion also, they are not a biological wealth for some, but for the others it may be. So, in that case it becomes difficult to decide that what kind of issuance, what kind of things are priority wise deciding becomes a difficult. So, these are some land related issues, and whether it is human related or land related or institutional, whole of a protected area, it becomes difficult to implement the governance issues and implement the rules and the regulations which have been formed. The next category of the state driven conservation is a territorial forest. These are the forest and they are broadly categorized into reserved forest and the protected forest. Now, this type of demarcation is mainly on the basis of the rights and the benefits which have been accorded to the people living in these areas. In protected areas it is totally protected in the sense that no human activity is allowed, and reserved forest in that, for example, certain things may be allowed. So, that kind of this thing, and territorial forests are very important for maintaining the ecological health of any region, for stabilizing the climate, and for providing so many types of raw materials, so many types of other things are being given by the forest. So, this also is a state driven, there are certain rules and regulations and certain policies and the mandates etc. have been given for the protection of the forest. These are some of the governance practices. Basically, there are field plans, forest cover assessment and forest certification. Now, field plans are done once in 10 years, and the meaning of field plan is that overall of a particular reserved or a protected forest, it is taken what kind of canopy is there, how much is the land area, what kind of the tree species are growing. In forest cover assessment, by the use of remote sensing we are doing, and the forest certification we just have certify what kind of forest it is depending upon the uses it gives. Then there are the challenges, ecological challenges, community related challenges, institutional and technology related challenges. There are measures for improving, certain measures have been given, support action research processes on governance, improve decision making processes, recognize and enforce local rights, strengthen governance at the local level, valuation of ecosystem services, addressing governance gaps in coastal and marine diversity, and investing in the capacities of governance institutions. So, while summing up, it can be said that although biological governance has got lot many clear demarcations in India, several issues have been tried to address, but then there are certain loopholes with respect to the implementation parts, and therefore, we have not been able to come up to that level. So, that is all for today.